Here one sees how the sun is depicted in the primary horoscope in various Egyptian zodiacs. The gray circles indicate the zodiacs where there were several identification options for the sun. In these cases, the final version was arrived at as a result of astronomical calculations and tests of their compliance with the secondary horoscopes. As one can see, the sun would most often be drawn as a circle. Sometimes one could see a narrow line of a crescent near one of its edges, which must stand for the new moon that is usually observed near the sun. The size of the lunar crescent is defined by the visible part of the lunar half, illuminated by the sun as observed from the Earth. When the distance between the sun and the moon on the celestial sphere is the greatest, that is, when the Earth is exactly between the sun and the moon, these celestial bodies would oppose each other as seen by a terrestrial observer, with the entire illuminated lunar half visible. This is when full moons occur. On the contrary, when the sun and the moon get close to each other on the celestial sphere and the moon gets in between the sun and Earth, the lunar crescent fades away and the night becomes moonless. The next day one sees a narrow crescent of the new moon. Since the moon doesn't get too far away from the sun over a single day, this crescent is always near the sun. Therefore, drawing a narrow crescent near the edge of the sun makes sense. The narrow crescent is added to the solar circle in the zodiacs DL, EM, and P2. In some of the Egyptian zodiacs the sun is represented in a rather implicit manner. In the demotic subscript horoscope from Brooks' zodiac, the sun isn't drawn, nor is its name written anywhere. Nevertheless, its position in Scorpio is indicated quite unmistakably. The symbol of Scorpio is shaded. This was noticed by Morozov.
The figure of Scorpio is shaded, which symbolizes its disappearance from sight due to sunshine. This takes place in November, whereas the figure of Taurus that opposes it is shaded black to symbolize the fact that it rains all night long, or culminates at midnight.
Under the culmination of a constellation, we understand its maximal elevation over the horizon. Obviously, the constellation that culminates at midnight is the one that's located on the opposite of the sun on the ecliptic. Furthermore, being located on the opposite of the sun on the ecliptic at dusk, this constellation begins to rise right across the sky in the east. When the night ends, this constellation disappears under the horizon in the west. Thus, the constellation in question can be observed in the sky all night long. All the other zodiacal constellations can only be seen during a part of the night. Thus, the constellation that culminates at midnight really reigns all night long. There is an indication of this in Brooks' zodiac. The constellation of Taurus is shaded black. In the two other horoscopes from Brooks' zodiac, the sun is drawn as a bird. Later, in the analysis of secondary horoscopes, we shall see that the sun would indeed often be depicted as a bird. In the long zodiac of Dendera, the sun in the secondary horoscopes is drawn as a bird several times. The bird that symbolizes the sun flies from one constellation to another. The representation of the sun in the colored Theban zodiac OU is of the utmost interest indeed. There is no symbol of the sun here, but it is indicated indirectly. The constellation of Taurus is explicitly marked as culminating. The symbol stands on a platform of sorts, which is raised high in the air by a human figure. This means that the sun was located in the part of the ecliptic that opposes Taurus. These constellations are Scorpio and Libra, and also possibly the adjacent parts of the neighboring constellations, Sagittarius and Virgo. Calculations demonstrate that the sun that day was in Virgo, near the cusp with Libra. Near the figure of Virgo, we see a hieroglyphic inscription that looks like two birds facing each other with three hieroglyphs below. It is possible that the inscription refers to the position of the sun in this constellation, since the sun could be drawn as a bird. In general, locating the sun and the moon in the Egyptian zodiacs isn't a complex task. However, due to the fact that the symbols used therein for both are very similar to each other, one would often have to consider several options of identifying the moon and the sun. Sometimes the number of options would grow due to the fact that the sun in the secondary spring equinox horoscope would be indicated by the same symbols as the ones found in the primary horoscope. In these cases, we are incapable of singling out the solar symbol pertinent to the primary horoscope, and we have to consider all the other options. This is the case with both zodiacs of Dendera, for instance. In the round zodiac of Dendera we see the Egyptian eye symbol in the solar circle between Pisces and Aries. It looks like a gallinaceous eye. The fact that the above-mentioned circle from the round zodiac is solar and not lunar was discovered as a result of astronomical calculations. In particular, the authors have considered the versions that suggest its lunar nature. None of them withheld the test for compliance with either planetary visibility attributes or secondary horoscopes, and were therefore rejected. One of the reasons why the circle with an eye from the round zodiac cannot be identified as the moon is as follows. In the fragment of the round zodiac, we see that both of the planets that one finds near the Sun, Venus and Mercury, are all in Aries, Pisces or Aquarius in the round zodiac. Venus is represented by the two female wayfaring figures between Pisces and Aries, whereas Mercury is a two-faced male figure with a rod between Pisces and Aquarius, which implies that the Sun should be nearby, since neither of these two planets ever travels too far away from the Sun. There are only two circles nearby that can stand for either the Sun or the Moon, both of them near the symbol of Pisces. One of them, a circle with an eye, is located between Pisces and Aries near Venus. The other one, with the figure of a young woman inside, is in Pisces, the side of Aquarius, near Mercury. Therefore, since the Sun should be somewhere in this vicinity, it means that if the circle with the eye stood for the Moon, the other circle, with the young woman, should invariably represent the Sun in the primary horoscope, which would otherwise be left with no valid symbols for it. However, this fails to concur with the visibility indications for Venus and Mercury. The matter at hand is as follows. The visibility indication used in the round zodiac is a star over the head of a planetary figure. Mercury, which we see very close to the circle with the young woman, has a star over its head, which means that the planet in question was visible. However, in that case Venus should be visible as well, since it is drawn considerably further away from the circle with the young woman. The further the planet is from the Sun, the better its visibility. However, there is no star over the head of Venus in the round zodiac. This also implies its invisibility due to proximity to the Sun. That's why, the other circle, the one that contains the eye, has to be identified as the Sun, which makes everything look sensible. Venus, being close to the Sun, is depicted with no star over its head due to being invisible, whereas Mercury is further away from the Sun and has therefore got a star over its head. Quite naturally, these contemplations are of a preliminary nature. The final conclusion about the visibility of planets can only be made as a result of astronomical calculations, when their position in relation to the Sun shall be identified with precision. Astronomical calculations must confirm the very fact that the Egyptian zodiacs contain symbols of planetary visibility. So far this is but a hypothesis of Morozov. Fomenko and Nosovsky have done all of it, and the preliminary considerations were confirmed perfectly. Apart from that, it turns out that the interpretations of the round zodiac where the eye stands for the Moon, are also invalid insofar as secondary horoscopes are concerned. The authors had to identify the circle with the eye as the Sun. This gave an ideal solution for the round zodiac. By the way, the second circle, with the young woman, also turned out to be a solar symbol and not a lunar one as Morozov had thought. It belongs in a secondary horoscope, though, and not the primary. However, one could also suggest another interpretation of the Egyptian eye symbol, at least, in the cases when it appeared as a planetary attribute in an Egyptian zodiac. In all of the Egyptian zodiacs, the eye symbol only stands for a planet twice, once in the round zodiac of Dendera, and once more in the P1 zodiac from the outer chamber of Padasiris, both times near the sign of Aries. Thus, in the round zodiac the Egyptian eye is located in the circle between Pisces and Aries, and in the P1 zodiac we see it over the head of the young woman that represents the moon between the signs of Aries and Taurus. However, the star called Eye, or Ram's Eye, that was quite famous in ancient astronomy, was located in Aries. It is the Alpha of Aries, the brightest star in a constellation. It is therefore possible that the drawing of an eye in the Egyptian zodiacs isn't so much related to the planet itself, the sun or the moon, as the fact that the planet was near the ram's eye on the date ciphered in the horoscope. The Latin word, ram, which means the same in English and implies a certain similarity between the terms, ram's eye, and the eye of Ra. Furthermore, it is known that Aries, or Ram, was often accompanied by the god Amun in Egyptian symbolism, whose name one more often encounters in conjunction with that of Ra than separately. This simply means that Ram's Eye and the Eye of Ra are different versions of the same name. Thus, the Eye of Ra from the Egyptian zodiac was most likely to stand for the sun or the moon in the vicinity of the star called Ram's Eye, the Alpha of Aries. Here one sees drawings of the moon from the primary horoscope of an Egyptian zodiac. The easiest identification case is when the moon is represented by a clearly visible crescent, as is the case in the zodiacs of Athribis or the colored Theban zodiac. It is somewhat more difficult to identify the moon in those of the Egyptian zodiacs where its symbolism is identical, or almost identical, to that of the sun. In the lesser zodiac of Esna, for instance, both the sun and the moon are drawn in the exact same manner, a circle with a crescent at one of its edges. As it was already mentioned earlier, the solar circle might have contained a narrow crescent near the edge to symbolize the fact that a narrow lunar crescent is always close to the sun. However, the moon could also be represented by this symbol, in which case we have to consider both versions equal. The final choice is made depending on how the identifications correlate to the secondary horoscopes of the zodiac in question. The lunar symbol in the zodiacs of Dendera was only estimated with exactitude as a result of extensive calculations which involved all figures that could possibly represent the moon. However, after verifying the solutions with the secondary horoscopes, which are especially abundant on the zodiacs of Dendera, it turned out that only a single satisfactory identification of the moon remains. The symbol of the moon in the Dendera zodiacs proved rather unexpected, since it was always considered part of Libra. It seems that none of the predecessors considered that, besides the primary horoscope, there are also several secondary ones. Moreover, in one of the secondary horoscopes of the Dendera zodiacs, that of the spring equinox, the sun is drawn in the exact same manner as it is in the primary horoscope. This confused researchers, who assumed there was only a single horoscope in each zodiac. As a result, they often mistook one of the suns for the moon, while the real moon symbol was interpreted instead as the goddess of justice, Hercules, or some other figure, and considered part of the constellation Libra. It turns out that Morozov had erred when he wrote that one finds a circle enclosing the goddess of justice over the constellation of Libra. Also, it is most odd that this alleged goddess of justice should be drawn naked, and with a finger in her mouth on top of that, as an infant, in other words. However, there is no known goddess of justice considered to be an infant in any mythology. A similar naked figure with a finger in its mouth can be seen on the long zodiac of Dendera, standing for the new moon this time, which is pointed out by Morozov himself. Indeed, we see a lunar circle with a distinct crescent inside it. The infantine symbol is most natural for the moon. The moon can be newborn at times, and we still refer to it as the new moon, young moon, etc., which isn't the case with any other planet or star. Morozov's reference to the circle on the balance scale of Libra being a frequent occurrence in other ancient zodiac and therefore unable to serve as a horoscope indication, allegedly being a mere part of the Libra constellation symbol instead, is hardly to be believed. Firstly, the Passover full moon often takes place in Libra. As we shall see, it would occasionally be indicated as such in the Egyptian zodiacs. This could result in an additional circle drawn in Libra, one that didn't refer to the primary horoscope. However, the example of the Dendera zodiacs demonstrates that the circle in Libra can also serve as a part of the primary horoscope. Secondly, even if a certain zodiac contains a circle in Libra that serves as a simple embellishment, it doesn't imply the same to be the case with all the other zodiacs. It is possible that some of the symbols on the most famous Egyptian zodiacs that were the most successful from the artistic point of view and served as examples for the subsequent generations of artists, could indeed become collated with the constellation symbols over the course of time, forming a unified hieroglyphic symbol. However, when we deal with the dating of an actual zodiac, it would be wrong to make the a priori assumption that the zodiac in question has embellishments of this kind. Whether or not this is the case can only be demonstrated by calculations that account for all possible identification options of a given zodiac.